All right, section 5.4. We are going to talk about, what do you think we're going to talk about today, class?
Indirect proofs.
That's right. A really hard one. Indirect proofs. And let me make this a little bit bigger. All right, over here. Right here. So let's talk about indirect proofs. So, just so if anybody is watching this or whatever, we watched some video about some guy that showed us a little bit about indirect proofs. Okay, so what was the example what about the one of being a school teacher? Does that make sense to you? Okay, so if I wanted to prove that I am a school teacher at Red Lion Christian, if I wanted to prove that, what I can do is I can assume the opposite. Okay, so I assume the opposite of what I want to prove. And the reason this indirect proof thing is in this little section with inequalities is because we use indirect proofs. Indirect proofs are a lot easier to use to prove something that is not equal. Okay, so if I want to prove something that is not equal to something, what do you think I assume? I assume that it is what? That it is equal, right? Or for instance, let's go the other way. Let's prove that Mr. Hamrick does not play for the Philadelphia Phillies. Okay, so let's prove that I do not, are you hearing me? That I do not play for the Phillies. So what do? We assume the opposite. So what am I going to assume then? Okay, so let's assume the opposite. So Mr. Hamrick plays, Mr. Hammy, H is fine. Mr. Hamrick plays for the Phillies, for the Phils, as I affectionately call them. Okay. All right, so Mr. Hamrick does play for the Phillies. All right, well, what we have to do is we have to reason logically, and I'll write this down as well. Let's reason logically. All right, are you writing all this down? Write these steps. Reason logically until we come up with a contradiction. Reason logically about my assumption until we find a contradiction. Contradiction. My writing is terrible on this. That's why I should stick with numbers, right? Okay, so reason logically until we come up with a contradiction. So let's do that. Let's reason logically until we come up with a contradiction. So, this is good. Running out of time. So give me some things that it's going to be a contradiction. If I play. Now we're assuming that I play for the Phillies. Okay. What's that?
We see you every day. Yeah, we see you every day. For like,
we've never seen you play a Phillies game.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're not listed as a Phillies player on their roster.
First of all, I'm 46 years old, and but I own a lot of things Phillies. Yeah. So we could say that. Well, I can't hit a fastball. Okay. I can't hit a fastball, or I should say curveball.
You are currently employed
can't hit a curveball.
Right.
I have not been to Citizens Bank Park since I don't know what year it was, probably about 4 or 5 years ago. So yeah, exactly. So that'd be a good Christmas present if you went. Yeah, it's so expensive. I can't go. So I've not been to a Citizens Bank Park since, I don't know, 2000. What is this, 11? So 2000, I don't know, 7 or something like that, okay? So if I played for the Phillies, I definitely would have been there by 2007. Would you agree with that? Okay. I have never had a paycheck. Never had a paycheck from the Phillies, okay? From the Phillies, all right? So I could keep on going and going and going. All right. So what did I come up with? These are all contradictions. If I played for the Phillies, I should be able to hit a curveball. Okay. I would have definitely been to Citizens Bank Park, right? Okay, because that's where they play their home games. I've never had a paycheck from the Phillies. I assume that everybody that plays for the Phillies gets a paycheck. Okay. I would think so. So these are all contradictions, aren't they? So I've contradicted what I assumed. I assumed the opposite, right? I assume that I do play for the Phillies because I'm trying to prove that I don't. So I assume that I do. These are all contradictions, which means what? Which means that right? So what we do now is we point out, let me write it like this. Let me do this. So now what we do is this. We point out the contradiction. All right, so we've already contradicted it. So we point out the contradiction that, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have written it like that. Point out the assumption leads to a contradiction. All right, so that the assumption, I'm just looking at this from the book, that the assumption leads to a contradiction. Leads to a contradiction. All right, and I've done that. All right, so these are contradictions, and so my assumption that I played for the Phillies must be what? That's right. So my assumption is, I say that my assumption is false, right? So what did I want to prove in the first place? Do you remember? I wanted to prove that I did not play for the Phillies. I do not play for the Phillies. So if my assumption is false, right, then my what I wanted to prove, then I don't know how to write that. Just put what I wanted to prove then is what? My
True.
is true. So what, I'll write it down. What I
You proved true.
I wanted, that's not the best way to write it, but what I wanted to prove is what? Is true. Remember, I wanted to prove that I did not play for the Phillies. All right? So my assumption is false because what was my assumption? My assumption was the opposite, right? My assumption was the opposite, and if I prove that to be false, then what I wanted to prove in the first place must be true. Does that make any sense? Okay. So how does that have anything to do with geometry? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's do this real quick. Okay, watch this. Remember what he said about, actually I like the example that what's his name? Tyler Tarver. It sounds like it should be Kyle Tarver. Tyle Tarver. Okay. Kyle. What is it? Tyler. Okay. So watch this. I don't know. Let's just. No, sorry. I'm running out of time, and I'm not thinking very good. Watch. Shh. Just let me concentrate, okay? You just throw out questions like that. What do you think? Okay, watch this. What was his thing he said? Yeah, so let's prove that a right triangle cannot have an obtuse angle. All right, so let's assume, we'll call this ABC. So what do? We assume the what? Opposite. Let's assume that angle A is an obtuse angle. So let's give it a degree. 100. He used 100, we'll use 100, okay? So let's assume that angle, remember, we're trying to prove that there is not an obtuse angle. So what do? We assume the opposite. So let's assume that we do have an obtuse angle in a right triangle. So if this is 100 degrees and this is 90 degrees, then what are the sum of the angles of this triangle? 190 degrees. But what do we know about the sum of the angles of a triangle? They can only be what? They can only be 180. So what is this? This is a contradiction, isn't it? This is a contradiction. What does it contradict? It contradicts the fact that the sum of the angles of a triangle can only be 180 degrees. So, guess what? What we assume then, we assume that we have an obtuse angle. So what we assume must be false. So that can't be right. So can you have a right triangle with an obtuse angle? No, you can't. And how did we prove that? We proved it with an indirect proof. Now, if I had the time, and we ran out of time, but if I had the time, I would actually write this out kind of like in paragraph form. All the stuff that I was saying, you would actually write that stuff out just basically in paragraph form. There's not 2 columns on this stuff, okay? No 2-column proofs. It's just like that. So give this homework a shot. I'll tell you what it is. And I'm sure, I think I always build in a day to go over this the next day because it is a little bit confusing at first. But here you go. Here it is.
Homeroom 10A, that's Mr. Cheadle's homeroom, will report to room 101 for a meeting with Mrs. Bell and I. Please make sure you check in with your study hall teacher and your class, if you have a class 8 period, before coming to the meeting.
Let me just
meeting is
double
in room
check.
101. That's for homeroom 10A only, Mr. Cheadle's class.
Yeah, we learn a lot of
Flash
stuff.
students
I'll tell
come
you
after
what.
school at 3:30.
let's
The big
do
guys
this.
for Flash supposed to come at 4:30, and the skill players are supposed to come at 5:30. Thank you.
And then here, I'll readjust a little bit here. Listen, this is what I'm doing. Okay, I'm going 11 to 20, and I'm giving you 27 to 28. Now, on a lot of these, they ask you, what's your very first step on this indirect proof? Assume what? The opposite. Okay, so they're just going to give you a phrase, and you're just going to have to assume the opposite. Okay, that's all you have to do with a lot of these. So not every one of these is a proof. Really, only these two are proofs right here, and we'll go over those tomorrow. Okay, thanks. Yep. 11 to 20, and then we'll do 27 and 28 as well.